He slid a crumpled $10 bill across the counter like a verdict, watching her face for greed, for weakness, for anything that would confirm what he already believed about humanity. But when she looked up with tears in her eyes and spoke 7 words, the billionaire felt his entire empire of certainty crumble. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if stories where one silent choice changes everything pull you in, stay glued, click like and hit subscribe, because this one doesn't let go. The coffee was terrible. Richard Ashford knew terrible coffee. He'd sipped espresso in Milan, Turkish brews in Istanbul, single-origin pour-overs in Tokyo cafes where silence was sacred. But here, in Millie's diner on the forgotten edge of Route 9, the coffee tasted like burnt rubber and regret. Perfect. He wanted terrible. He wanted real. He wanted to see people stripped of pretense, the way they truly were when they thought no one important was watching. Richard adjusted his reading glasses, drugstore frames, not the Italian ones, and studied the laminated menu with its faded photographs of pancakes and meatloaf. The vinyl booth seat cracked beneath him. Somewhere in the kitchen, a radio played country music too quietly to identify the song. 3 other patrons occupied the diner, an elderly man reading a newspaper, a trucker hunched over chicken fried steak, and a young mother trying to keep her toddler from coloring on the table. None of them recognized him. Good. In his real life, his Manhattan penthouse, his corner office on the 47th floor, his galas and board meetings, Richard Ashford was a name that made investors sweat and competitors flinch. 73 years old with a fortune that could buy small countries, he'd built his empire on one simple principle. Everyone had a price. Everyone could be bought, manipulated, or exposed as the fraud they truly were. Especially family. His son wanted the company but lacked vision. His daughter wanted his money but called twice a year. His ex-wife wanted vindication. His shareholders wanted growth. Everyone wanted something, and Richard had spent decades believing that made him smart. Seeing through the performance, understanding that human nature was fundamentally transactional. But lately something had shifted. Maybe it was the heart attack 6 months ago, the one his doctor said was a warning. Maybe it was turning 73 and realizing he'd built an empire with no one to leave it to, no one worthy anyway. Maybe it was the gnawing sensation that he'd spent 50 years winning a game that didn't matter. So he'd started testing people. Not with millions or business deals. Those tests were too obvious, too loaded with expectation. No, Richard tested people with small moments, pocket change, the kind of situations where someone's true character leaked through before they could perform for an audience. He tipped a parking attendant $100 to see if the young man would report it or pocket it. He'd pocketed it, then bought his girlfriend flowers. Richard had him followed. He'd accidentally dropped his wallet near a homeless man to see if he'd steal or return it. He'd returned it, asking nothing in return. Richard had sent an anonymous donation to the shelter where the man slept. Each test taught him something. Each result was filed away in his mind like evidence in a trial where humanity stood accused. Today's test would be simple, a $10 tip on a $7 meal. Not enough to be life-changing but more than expected. Enough to see who someone really was. The waitress approached with a coffee pot, and Richard studied her the way he'd once studied quarterly reports. She was younger than he'd expected, mid-30s maybe, though the exhaustion etched around her eyes added years. Dark hair pulled into a practical ponytail, minimal makeup, a name tag that read Claire, pinned slightly crooked on her uniform. The uniform itself told a story, clean but worn, the fabric thin from too many washes, a small stain near the hem that hadn't quite come out. But it was her hands Richard noticed most. They were steady as she poured his coffee, despite the calluses, despite the bandage wrapped around her left thumb, despite the way her knuckles looked raw and reddened. Hands that had worked hard, that knew labor, that didn't expect gentleness from the world. "Can I get you started with anything, or do you need a minute?" Her voice was pleasant but tired, the practiced warmth of someone who'd learned to smile through exhaustion. "The meat loaf," Richard said, pointing at the menu without looking up. "And water, no ice." "You got it." She scribbled on her pad, then paused. "Fair warning, the meatloaf's better than the coffee." Richard glanced up, surprised. She offered a small, conspiratorial smile that didn't reach her tired eyes, then moved to the next table before he could respond. Interesting. Most waitresses would have defended the coffee or said nothing. She'd acknowledged the truth with humor, like someone who was past the point of pretending. Like someone who had nothing left to lose by being honest. Richard watched her work as he pretended to read the newspaper he'd grabbed from the counter. She moved efficiently between tables, refilling the trucker's coffee without being asked, bringing extra crayons for the toddler, checking on the elderly man with genuine warmth. Not the performance of good service but the real thing. She seemed to actually care, or at least cared enough to make the effort convincing. When she brought his meatloaf, surprisingly decent actually, Richard noticed she'd included extra napkins and a small side of gravy he hadn't ordered. "Thought you might want it," she said simply. "No charge." She was gone before he could ask why. He ate slowly, observing. The lunch rush never materialized. Apparently Route 9 didn't get much traffic anymore. Claire moved between her few tables with quiet competence, but Richard noticed other things too. The way she paused at the window staring at something outside. The way she checked her phone during a lull, her expression tightening before she tucked it away. The way she rolled her shoulders like they ached. After 45 minutes, Richard pushed his plate aside and waited. Claire appeared with the check, setting it face down on the table. "Whenever you're ready, no rush." "The meatloaf was good," Richard said. "I'll tell the cook. He'll be pleased, doesn't get many compliments." She smiled, and this time it seemed more genuine. "Can I get you anything else?" "No thank you." She nodded and turned to clear the trucker's table. Richard pulled out his wallet, a worn leather one he'd bought specifically for these excursions, and counted out 7 singles for the meal. Then deliberately he added a $10 bill, smoothing it flat on top of the check. $17 total. A $10 tip on a $7 meal. He stood, leaving the money on the table, and walked toward the door. But he didn't leave. Instead, he pretended to study the community bulletin board near the entrance. Yard sales, lost cats, a handyman offering services, while watching Claire's reflection in the glass door. She approached the table, picked up the check folder, and opened it. Richard watched her face in the reflection. She froze. Her eyes widened slightly, then she looked around the diner, looking for him, he realized. Her hand trembled as she counted the bills again, as if she'd miscounted. Then she pressed her lips together, and something happened that Richard hadn't anticipated. Her eyes filled with tears. Not the tears of greed or excitement. Not the calculated tears of manipulation he'd seen countless times in boardrooms and negotiations. These were different, raw, unguarded, the kind of tears someone shed when they were alone and thought no one was watching. Claire closed her eyes, took a shaky breath, and pressed the money against her chest like it was something precious. Then she did something that made Richard's carefully constructed test collapse entirely. She walked directly toward him. Richard tensed, prepared for gratitude, for performance, for whatever show people put on when they wanted something. But when Claire reached him, she wasn't smiling. She looked at him with those tired, tearful eyes, and her voice cracked when she spoke. "Sir, I can't accept this." Richard blinked. In 50 years of testing humanity, no one had ever said that. "It's just a tip," he said carefully. "I know, but..." She glanced at the money in her hand, then back at him. "This is too much. You don't understand. Today I had to choose between my daughter's medicine and our electric bill, and I chose the medicine, which means tonight we're going to sit in the dark, and I've been standing here for 6 hours trying not to cry because I'm 34 years old and I can't keep the lights on, and I don't want you to tip me out of pity." The words tumbled out like a confession she hadn't meant to make, and immediately her face flushed with embarrassment. She looked down, blinking rapidly. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said all that. I just meant, thank you, but I can't take charity. I need to earn." "What's your daughter's name?" Richard interrupted. Claire looked up, surprised. "What? Your daughter? What's her name?" "Emma. She's 7. Claire's voice softened involuntarily, the way parents' voices do when they speak of their children. "She has asthma. The inhaler's expensive even with insurance, and my ex doesn't, he's not in the picture." Richard studied her face, the exhaustion, the pride warring with desperation, the fierce love that made her choose darkness over her daughter's breathing. "The tip isn't charity," he said quietly. "You brought me extra gravy I didn't order. You warned me about the coffee. You did your job well. That's worth $10. "Not really," Claire said, attempting a weak smile. "The gravy probably cost 30 cents. Not to me." They stood there for a moment, the diner's fluorescent lights humming above them, the country music station playing something about lost time and second chances. "Why are you really giving me this?" Claire asked, and her directness surprised him again. No performance. No manipulation. Just honest confusion from someone too tired to pretend. Richard opened his mouth to give his prepared answer. Something casual, something that would end the test and let him leave with his data collected and his worldview confirmed. But what came out instead was, "Because I'm trying to figure out if there are any good people left in the world." Comment below, what would you have done with the $10? Let us know. Backend index pointing down. Claire's expression shifted, not to gratitude or sympathy, but to something that looked almost like sadness. "And?" she asked softly. "Did you figure it out?" Richard didn't answer. He couldn't because Claire was still holding out the money, still offering to give back what she desperately needed, and that single gesture had just destroyed 50 years of careful cynicism. "Keep it," he said finally. "Please." Claire hesitated, then slowly lowered her hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means." But then she did something that would haunt Richard Ashford for the rest of his life. She looked at him with those exhausted, honest eyes and she said, "I hope you find what you're looking for. But maybe you're asking the wrong question." "What do you mean?" "You're looking for good people," Claire said, tucking the money carefully into her apron pocket like it was made of glass. "But good people aren't the ones who pass your tests. Good people are the ones who make you want to be better." She smiled then, small, sad, genuine, and walked back to her tables. Richard stood frozen by the bulletin board, his hand on the door handle, his entire understanding of human nature cracking like ice beneath him. He'd come here to test her. But somehow, impossibly, she tested him instead. And he'd failed. Richard didn't leave immediately. He stood outside Millie's diner in the parking lot, car keys in hand, staring at his reflection in the window of his rented sedan. A forgettable gray Toyota, not the Mercedes waiting in his Manhattan garage. Good people are the ones who make you want to be better. 7 words. 7 words from a waitress who couldn't keep her lights on, and they'd lodged in his chest like shrapnel. He thought of his son Michael, who'd called last week asking for a position he hadn't earned. Richard had said no, had lectured him about merit and hard work, had hung up feeling righteous. But when was the last time Richard had made Michael want to be better? When had he done anything except hold up hoops and watch his son fail to jump through them? He thought of his daughter, Jennifer, who'd stopped calling after he'd criticized her husband at Thanksgiving. She'd accused Richard of never being satisfied, of treating her life like a business acquisition that had underperformed. He'd called her ungrateful. She'd called him cruel. She hadn't been wrong. Richard climbed into the Toyota and sat in silence. Through the diner window, he could see Claire moving between tables, her posture a little straighter now, as if the $10 had given her something beyond money, maybe just the feeling that the universe wasn't entirely indifferent to her struggle. He started the engine, then turned it off. Started it again. Turned it off. What am I doing? Richard Ashford didn't second-guess himself. He made decisions, executed them, and moved forward. Doubt was for weak men, for failures, for people who hadn't built empires from nothing. But sitting in this parking lot, watching a waitress who tried to refuse his money because she was too proud to take charity, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Shame. Not the performative shame of being caught, but the deep, gnawing shame of recognizing you've become someone you wouldn't respect. His phone buzzed. A text from his attorney. "Need your signature on the will revisions. Are we still moving forward with the primary structure?" The primary structure. 50 million to charity, the big, impressive charities that would put his name on buildings. 20 million to Michael, contingent on him never touching the company. 20 million to Jennifer, with conditions about who she could marry and how she could spend it. The rest in trust, controlled by a board Richard had personally selected to ensure his vision continued long after his death. It was a will designed to control, to test, to prove that Richard Ashford's judgment would outlast Richard Ashford's heartbeat. It was a will that would make no one want to be better. Richard looked at the text for a long moment, then typed, "Hold off. Need to reconsider." He pocketed the phone and sat in the silence of the Toyota, watching the afternoon light slant through the diner windows, illuminating the tired waitress who'd somehow seen through him with more clarity than he'd ever seen through himself. Then, impulsively, he got out of the car and walked back inside. Claire was refilling the elderly man's coffee when Richard walked back in. She glanced up, surprise flickering across her face, then something else, concern maybe or wariness. Like someone who'd been vulnerable once and was now regretting it. Richard slid back into his booth, suddenly uncertain. He'd negotiated billion-dollar deals without hesitation, but sitting here trying to figure out what to say to a waitress who'd accidentally turned his life inside out, he felt like a teenager asking someone to prom. Claire approached slowly, coffee pot in hand. "Forget something?" "Yes," Richard said. Then, "No. I don't know." She set the coffee pot on the table and slid into the booth across from him. A casual intimacy that suggested she'd read his discomfort and decided to make this easier. Up close, Richard could see more details. A small scar above her left eyebrow, laugh lines that suggested she'd smiled more in the past, and eyes that were hazel, not brown like he'd thought. "Look," Claire said gently, If you're worried I'm going to tell people about the tip or make a scene, I won't. I'm grateful truly, but I'm not going to. That's not why I came back, Richard interrupted. I came back because you said something that... He paused, struggling with unfamiliar honesty. You said I was asking the wrong question. Claire studied him, and Richard had the uncomfortable sensation of being truly seen, not as Richard Ashford, billionaire and titan of industry, but as an old man sitting in a diner, lost. Okay, she said carefully. I've spent my whole life testing people, Richard said. Seeing who they really are when they think no one's watching. And I've learned that everyone's corrupt, everyone's selfish, everyone has a price. It's made me very successful and very... He stopped, the word catching in his throat. Alone? Claire offered quietly. Yes. She nodded slowly like she understood. Can I tell you something? Please. When you left that $10, my first thought wasn't, thank God I can pay the electric bill. My first thought was, what does he want? Claire's voice was steady but sad. Because in my experience, when people give you things you desperately need, there's usually a catch. My ex used to do that, give me just enough to keep me grateful, keep me dependent, keep me from leaving. Richard felt something twist in his chest. But you tried to give the money back. Because I'd rather sit in the dark than owe someone, Claire said simply. I learned that the hard way. Freedom costs more than electricity. They sat in silence for a moment, the diner humming with its quiet afternoon rhythm around them. But here's the thing, Claire continued, leaning forward slightly. You asked if there are good people left in the world. That's a test where everyone fails because you're looking for proof of what you already believe. You want to find corruption so you can feel smart for spotting it. That's not, Richard started then stopped. Because it was true. The better question, Claire said, is not, are there good people? But, can people be good to each other? Because good isn't something you are, it's something you do. It's a choice you make every day, and some days you fail and some days you succeed, but the trying matters more than the result. Richard stared at her. How do you know this? How are you? He gestured vaguely, trying to encompass everything. Her wisdom, her clarity, her ability to try to refuse money she desperately needed. Claire laughed, but it was tinged with bitterness. You think wisdom comes from having things figured out? I'm 34, divorced, broke, raising a kid with medical problems in a town with no opportunities. I work 60 hours a week and still can't afford to turn on the lights. I don't know anything except how to survive. That's more than most people know, Richard said quietly. Maybe. Claire glanced toward the kitchen, where her boss was visible through the window, cleaning the grill. But it doesn't pay well. Richard made a decision. It was impulsive and possibly foolish, but sitting across from this woman who'd accidentally shattered his worldview, he didn't care. What if I offered you money? He asked. Real money. Enough to pay your bills, fix whatever's broken, give your daughter what she needs. Claire's expression immediately shuddered. I already told you. Not as charity. As payment. Richard leaned forward. I need to understand something. I need to know if it's possible to change to be better. And I think you might be able to teach me that. Teach you? Claire's eyebrows rose. I'm a waitress. I don't have anything to teach a man who wears a watch that costs more than my car. Richard glanced down at his wrist, realizing he'd forgotten to remove his Patek Philippe, a $40,000 mistake that had just blown his cover. He'd been so unsettled he'd forgotten his own disguise. You noticed, he said. I notice everything. It's how you survive when you have nothing. Claire's voice wasn't accusatory, just factual. You're not a regular guy who tips big. You're someone pretending to be regular, testing people, trying to catch them being human. Who are you really? Richard could have lied. Should have lied. But something about Claire's directness, her complete lack of performance, made him want to offer the same honesty back. My name is Richard Ashford. He watched for recognition. There was none. Should I know that name? Claire asked. Despite everything, Richard almost laughed. In Manhattan, his name opened doors and closed deals. Here in Millie's diner on Route 9, he was nobody. It was strangely liberating. I own things, Richard said. Companies, buildings, investments. I'm worth approximately $4 billion, and I came here today to test you with a $10 tip because I'm dying and I don't know what to do with any of it. The words hung in the air between them. Claire's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't speak. I'm not dying immediately, Richard clarified. But I'm 73, I had a heart attack 6 months ago, and my doctor says I need to reduce stress and find meaning in my life or the next one will kill me. So I've been testing people, trying to figure out who deserves what I've built. And then you? He stopped, shaking his head. You tried to give back the thing you needed most because you didn't want to be pitted. Who does that? Someone who's been pitted before, Claire said quietly. Someone who knows pity is just cruelty wearing a halo. Richard studied her face, the exhaustion, the pride, the fierce intelligence that poverty hadn't dimmed, and realized something profound. He'd spent 50 years surrounding himself with people who wanted his money, and in doing so he'd never met anyone who actually deserved it. Have dinner with me, Richard said suddenly. What? Not here. A real dinner. Let me take you somewhere nice, let me ask you questions, let me… He struggled for words. Let me try to understand what I've been missing. Claire stared at him like he'd suggested they fly to the moon. I don't understand what's happening, she said slowly. Is this some kind of pretty woman thing? Because I'm not. No, Richard said firmly. Nothing like that. I'm not interested in. I'm 73 years old, and I'm trying very badly to ask a wise person for help. I'm not wise. I'm just tired. Maybe that's the same thing. Claire looked at him for a long moment, and Richard saw her calculating, weighing risk against opportunity, pride against desperation, the fear of being used against the possibility that this strange old man might actually be sincere. Why me? She asked finally. You could hire therapists, life coaches, spiritual advisors. Why does it matter what a broke waitress thinks? Because you're the first person in 50 years who tried to give money back, Richard said simply. And because you asked me what I was looking for. No one asks me questions anymore. They just wait for me to give them things. Claire bit her lip thinking. Through the window, Richard could see the sun lowering in the sky, afternoon sliding toward evening. Soon she'd have to go home to her daughter, to her apartment where the lights wouldn't turn on. One dinner, Claire said finally. But I have conditions. Name them. 1. You don't give me any money. Not tonight, not after, not as a thank you. If you want my time, you get my time, but you don't get to make me owe you. Richard nodded. Agreed. 2. This ends when I say it ends. If I get uncomfortable, if this feels wrong, I walk away and you don't follow me or try to find me again. Agreed. 3. You're honest with me. No more tests, no more games, no checking to see what kind of person I am when I think no one's watching. If you want to understand something, you ask me directly. Agreed, Richard said and meant it. Claire exhaled slowly. Then okay. One dinner. But it has to be after my shift ends at 9, and I need to be home by 11 because my neighbor watches Emma until then. I'll pick you up at 9, Richard said. No. Claire's voice was firm. I'll meet you. Tell me where and I'll drive myself. Of course she would. She was protecting herself, maintaining control, refusing to be vulnerable. Richard recognized it because he'd built his entire life around the same principle. There's a restaurant called Marcello's about 20 minutes from here. Do you know it? Claire shook her head. I'll text you the address. What's your number? She rattled it off and Richard typed it into his phone, then sent her a text with the restaurant's location. A moment later, Claire's phone buzzed in her apron pocket. 9:30, she said. I'll need time to change. You don't need to. Yes, I do. Claire stood up, straightening her uniform. If I'm having dinner with a billionaire, I'm not showing up in a waitress uniform that smells like coffee and French fries. I have one nice dress. I'll wear it. She walked away before Richard could respond, returning to her tables, back to work as if the last 10 minutes hadn't just happened. But Richard noticed something different in her posture now, not hope exactly but something like curiosity. Like someone who'd opened a door she'd kept locked for a long time and was surprised to find light on the other side. Richard sat in the booth for another minute, then stood and left $100 bill under his water glass where Claire would find it later. He knew she'd be angry. Knew she'd said no more money. But he also knew her lights would be on tonight, and her daughter would be able to breathe, and sometimes breaking your word was the most honest thing you could do. As he walked to his car, Richard pulled out his phone and called his attorney. Matthew? It's Richard. About the will. I want you to cancel everything. All of it. Cancel? Richard, we've been working on this for months. I know. Cancel it anyway. I'm starting over. He hung up before his attorney could argue and stood in the parking lot, watching the diner through the window where Claire was pouring coffee, refilling waters, smiling at customers who would never know they were being served by the woman who just changed a billionaire's life. Good people are the ones who make you want to be better. Richard Ashford had spent 73 years building an empire. Tonight he was going to learn what it might be worth. Richard arrived at Marcello's at 9:15, early despite his usual fashionable lateness. The restaurant was one he'd discovered years ago during a business trip, Elegant but not ostentatious, the kind of place where the food mattered more than being seen. He'd called ahead and Tony, the owner, had given him the corner table without asking questions. Now Richard sat alone watching the door, feeling absurdly like a nervous teenager. His palms were actually sweating. When was the last time that had happened? 9:30 came and went. 9:45. 10 o'clock. She wasn't coming. Richard told himself it didn't matter, that this was probably better anyway, that he'd been foolish to think a waitress from a Route 9 diner could teach him anything meaningful. But the disappointment that settled in his chest felt far heavier than logic suggested it should. At 10:15 the door opened and Claire walked in. She'd changed into a navy blue dress, simple, modest, probably years old, and had pulled her hair down from its ponytail. She looked tired still but different. Nervous. Beautiful in an understated way that had nothing to do with youth or fashion and everything to do with dignity. Their eyes met across the restaurant and Richard saw her hesitate, saw her almost turn around and leave. But then she straightened her shoulders and walked toward his table with the same determined grace she'd shown carrying coffee at the diner. "I'm sorry I'm late," she said, sliding into the chair across from him. "I had to give Emma her breathing treatment and then she wanted a story, and then she asked why Mommy was wearing her fancy dress, and that turned into a whole conversation about where I was going and why." "You don't have to apologize," Richard said. "I'm just glad you came." Claire looked around the restaurant, the white tablecloths, the soft lighting, the other diners in their expensive clothes, and Richard saw her armor snap into place. "I don't belong here," she said quietly. "Neither do I," Richard said, and it was the most honest thing he'd said in years. Claire looked at him sharply. "You're a billionaire. You belong anywhere you want. Money doesn't make you belong. It just makes people pretend you do." Something in her expression softened. A waiter appeared with menus and water, and Richard noticed how Claire studied the menu with the careful attention of someone calculating costs. He told her he was paying, but she was still counting dollars in her head, still refusing to be a burden. "Order anything," Richard said gently. "And I mean anything. This isn't a test and I'm not keeping score." Claire looked up. "Then why am I here?" It was the same directness that had unsettled him at the diner, the refusal to pretend or perform. Richard realized he'd spent so long around people who said what they thought he wanted to hear that he'd forgotten what honesty sounded like. "Because you asked me if I'd found what I was looking for," Richard said. "And I realized I didn't know what I was looking for anymore. So I'm supposed to help you find it? Maybe. Or maybe you're supposed to tell me I'm looking in the wrong places." Claire set down her menu. "You want to know what I think? Honestly? Please. I think you're a man who's built his entire life around being right, being smart, being above everyone else. And now you're getting old and you're scared that all of that was empty, that you missed something important, and you're looking for someone to either confirm your worst fears or give you permission to change. And you picked me because I'm broke and grateful, so you think I'll tell you whatever you want to hear." The words hit like a punch. Richard sat back, stunned by her accuracy. "But here's the thing," Claire continued, her voice softening. "I can't give you what you're looking for because I don't have it. I'm barely surviving. I don't have wisdom or answers or some magical insight into what makes life meaningful. I have a 7-year-old daughter with asthma, an ex-husband who sends money when he remembers to, which is almost never, and a job that pays $9 an hour plus tips. If you're looking for someone who's figured life out, you're talking to the wrong person." "Maybe you're exactly the right person," Richard said quietly, "because you're still trying. You're still showing up, still doing the work, still choosing your daughter's medicine over the electric bill. That's not survival. That's love." Claire's eyes suddenly filled with tears and she looked away quickly, blinking hard. "Sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to, it's been a long day. Don't apologize." Richard leaned forward. "When was the last time someone asked you what you needed? Not your daughter, not your job, not your bills. What do you need?" Claire stared at him and Richard saw something break open in her expression. Not breaking apart but breaking open, like a door that had been locked for so long she'd forgotten there was anything behind it. "I need to stop being so tired," she said, her voice cracking. "I need one day where I don't have to choose between my daughter's health and keeping the lights on. I need to not feel like I'm failing every single second of every single day. I need—" She stopped, pressing her hand to her mouth. "What?" Richard asked gently. "I need to feel like this might get better," Claire whispered. "Like I'm not going to be doing this forever. Like Emma might have a chance at something more than I had. But I don't know how to get there. I work as hard as I can and it's never enough and I'm so tired of pretending I'm not drowning." The words hung between them, raw and honest and breaking Richard's heart in ways he didn't know were still possible. "I found the $100, Claire said suddenly, changing subjects. "Under the water glass. After you left." Richard waited. "I should give it back. That was the deal, no money." "But you won't," Richard said, and it wasn't a question. "No," Claire admitted. "Because Emma needs new shoes, and I need to be less proud than I am angry." She looked at him with those exhausted, honest eyes. "Does that make me weak?" "It makes you human." The waiter returned, and they ordered, Claire choosing carefully, Richard ordering wine she didn't drink because she said she needed to drive home. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, and Richard noticed how Claire savored each bite, how she ate slowly, making it last. "Tell me about Emma," Richard said finally. Claire's face transformed when she talked about her daughter, the exhaustion lifting, replaced by fierce love and pride. She told him about Emma's obsession with space, how she wanted to be an astronaut, how she'd drawn pictures of the moon and taped them to every wall in their apartment. She told him about Emma's courage during asthma attacks, how she'd learned to stay calm, to breathe through the fear. She told him about homework and bedtime battles and the way Emma still believed the world was good because Claire had worked so hard to shield her from the parts that weren't. Richard listened, and with each detail, something inside him shifted. He thought of his own children, Michael and Jennifer, grown now and distant, and realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd talked about them with anything resembling the love in Claire's voice. He'd raised them with expectations and conditions, had measured their worth by their achievements, had loved them the way a CEO loves quarterly earnings. Conditionally, strategically, with an eye toward return on investment. "You're a good mother," Richard said when Claire paused. "I don't know about that," Claire said, but she smiled. "I'm trying. That's all I can do." Comment below. What's the most valuable lesson someone taught you? Backend index pointing down. "That's all any of us can do," Richard said quietly. They talked for another hour, about Claire's childhood, her ex-husband, her dreams of going back to school someday to study nursing. Richard found himself sharing things he hadn't told anyone. His regrets about his children, his failed marriage, the loneliness of being constantly surrounded by people who wanted something from him. At 11:15, Claire glanced at her phone and tensed. "I need to go," she said. "My neighbor has to leave by 11:30, and I'm already pushing it." Richard signaled for the check, which appeared immediately. He paid without looking at it, old habit, and stood to walk Claire to her car. Outside, the night was cool and clear, stars visible away from city lights. Claire's car was a battered Honda Civic with a dent in the passenger door and a child's car seat visible in the back. She paused at the driver's door, keys in hand, looking uncertain. "Thank you for dinner," she said. "It was nice. Really nice. Thank you for coming. For being honest with me." Claire nodded, then hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Why did you really come back to the diner? After you'd already left?" Richard considered lying, offering something simple and comfortable. But Claire had given him honesty all night, and he owed her the same. "Because you made me feel something I haven't felt in 50 years, Richard said. "You made me feel like I might be wrong about everything I believe. And instead of being threatened by that, I wanted to understand it." Claire studied his face in the dim parking lot light. "And do you understand it?" "I'm starting to." She smiled, sad and wise and tired. "What are you going to do now?" "I don't know yet," Richard admitted. "But I think I'm going to rewrite my will." "Because of me?" "Because of what you taught me." Richard pulled his wallet from his jacket, not the worn one from the diner but his real one, fine leather with his cards and ID. He pulled out a business card and handed it to her. "My phone number. If you ever need anything, and I mean anything, not just money but advice or help or someone to talk to, you call me." Claire took the card, studying it. "Richard Ashford, CEO, Ashford Enterprises." She looked up. "You really are a billionaire." "Unfortunately." "Why unfortunately?" "Because it's kept me from meeting people like you." Claire slipped the card into her purse. "I won't call. You know that, right? I can't be the charity case that makes you feel better about your life." "You're not a charity case," Richard said firmly. "You're the person who reminded me what courage looks like." Claire's eyes filled with tears again, and she blinked them away impatiently. "I really have to go." "I know." She opened her car door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I hope you figure out what to do with your billions. I hope you find people who make you want to be better, not people who make you feel better about being right. And I hope." She stopped, shaking her head. "What?" "I hope you realize you already have what you're looking for. You're just too scared to admit you might be worth loving without conditions." She got in her car before Richard could respond, and he stood in the parking lot watching her taillights disappear into the darkness, her words echoing in his mind like a verdict. Worth loving without conditions. Richard Ashford had spent 73 years believing love was transactional, that worth had to be earned, that everything, including human connection, came with a price tag attached. But standing alone in a parking lot, watching a broke waitress drive home to her daughter and her dark apartment, Richard realized something that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. Maybe he'd been wrong about everything. Richard didn't sleep that night. He sat in his hotel room, a modest choice by his standards, a Holiday Inn rather than the Four Seasons, and stared at his phone. Claire's number was saved in his contacts now, her name appearing between his children's. Jennifer, Claire Mitchell, Michael. The alphabetical accident felt significant somehow. At 2 a.m. he opened his laptop and began writing. Not emails or memos or business plans, but something else entirely. A letter to his children. An apology. An explanation. An attempt to say everything he'd been too proud or too certain to say for 50 years. Dear Michael and Jennifer. I'm writing this at 2 a.m. in a Holiday Inn in a town you've never heard of, and I'm not entirely sure why except that I met someone today who made me realize I've been a terrible father. He deleted it. Started over. Deleted again. How do you apologize for a lifetime? How do you explain that you built your entire philosophy of life on a foundation of sand, and you dragged your children down with you, teaching them that love was conditional and worth was measured in achievements and that vulnerability was weakness? At 4 a.m. Richard gave up on the letter and did something else instead. He opened his will, the document his attorney had spent months perfecting, and read through it with new eyes. Every clause was a test. Every condition was a judgment. Every dollar came with strings attached, with expectations, with the ghost of Richard Ashford reaching from beyond the grave to make sure his children knew they'd never been quite good enough. I leave $20 million to my son, Michael Ashford, provided he completes an MBA from an accredited institution and demonstrates competency in. I leave $20 million to my daughter, Jennifer Ashford, with the stipulation that she divorce her current husband within. Richard closed his laptop feeling sick. This wasn't a will. It was a weapon. One final test to prove he'd been right all along about everyone's corruption, everyone's greed, everyone's ultimate failure to meet his impossible standards. And the worst part? His children would probably comply. They'd jump through the hoops, meet the conditions, collect their money, and spend the rest of their lives resenting him. Just as he'd resented his own father, who'd done the exact same thing. The cycle would continue. The poison would spread. And Richard Ashford's legacy would be teaching his children that love was something you earned, not something you were simply given for existing. Good people are the ones who make you want to be better. At 6 a.m. Richard called his attorney. Matthew, it's Richard. I know it's early. I need you to draw up a new will. Completely new. Nothing from the old one. His attorney's voice was heavy with sleep and confusion. Richard, we just canceled everything yesterday. What do you want now? Something simple, Richard said. Split everything equally between Michael and Jennifer. No conditions. No tests. No strings. Just give it to them. All of it. Silence on the other end. Matthew? Richard, are you feeling all right? Have you been drinking? I'm completely sober. I want my children to inherit everything, and I want them to inherit it without having to prove they deserve it. Can you do that? Of course I can, but... Richard, this is $4 billion we're talking about. You don't want any provisions? Any protections? Any requirements that they use it responsibly? No, Richard said firmly. I want them to have it because they're my children. Not because they've earned it or proven themselves worthy or met some arbitrary standard I've set. Just because they're mine. More silence. This is about that waitress, isn't it? Matthew said finally. The one from yesterday. Richard, I know you're going through something, but making major estate decisions based on a conversation with a stranger? She's not a stranger, Richard interrupted. She's someone who reminded me what love looks like. And it doesn't look like my will. Fine, Matthew sighed. I'll draft something. But Richard? I'm recommending a mental health evaluation before we file this. Not because I think you're incompetent, but because your children will almost certainly challenge this, and they'll use any excuse to claim undue influence. Let them challenge it, Richard said. Let them fight for money they already have. Maybe it'll teach them something. He hung up and sat in the pre-dawn darkness, feeling simultaneously liberated and terrified. He'd just made a decision that would change his children's lives, that would dissolve the structures he'd spent years building, that would render meaningless all his careful tests and conditions. And it felt right in a way nothing had felt right in decades. At 7 a.m. Richard's phone rang. Unknown number. Hello? Mr. Ashford? A woman's voice, not Claire's. Older, nervous. This is Margaret Chin. I'm Claire Mitchell's neighbor. She gave me your number in case of emergency and there's been an incident. Richard's stomach dropped. What kind of incident? Claire's daughter, Emma. She had a severe asthma attack about an hour ago. Claire's at County Hospital with her right now. Emma's stable but they're keeping her for observation and she's not doing well. She asked me to call you. I don't know why but she said you'd want to know. Richard was already grabbing his jacket, his keys. Which hospital? County General. But Mr. Ashford, I don't think they'll let you see her unless you're family. Tell Claire I'm on my way. He hung up and ran. County General Hospital was a 40-minute drive that Richard made in 25, speeding laws be damned. He parked in the emergency zone and ran inside, still wearing yesterday's clothes, his usually immaculate hair uncombed, his billion-dollar composure completely shattered. Emma Mitchell, he told the receptionist. 7 years old, asthma attack. Where is she? The receptionist looked at him skeptically. Are you family? Richard hesitated. What was he? A stranger who'd given her mother a tip? A billionaire playing at understanding poverty? A lonely old man who'd decided one waitress's wisdom was worth more than 50 years of his own experience? I'm her grandfather, Richard said, the lie emerging before he could stop it. The receptionist's expression softened. Pediatric ICU, 3rd floor, room 312. But sir? Visiting hours don't start until... Richard was already moving toward the elevators. He found room 312 and stopped outside, looking through the window. Emma was small in the hospital bed, oxygen mask over her face, monitors beeping steadily. Claire sat beside her, holding her daughter's hand, and even from the doorway Richard could see she was crying, not the quiet, controlled tears from the diner, but the raw, terrified sobs of a mother who'd almost lost everything. Richard knocked softly. Claire looked up, and her face crumpled with relief when she saw him. She stood, and Richard entered the room, and then, surprisingly, naturally, Claire walked into his arms and let herself break. He held her while she cried, this woman he'd known for less than 24 hours, and it felt more real than any relationship he'd built in 73 years. She couldn't breathe, Claire whispered against his shoulder. She woke up at 2 a.m. and she couldn't breathe and her inhaler wasn't working and I called 911 but they took so long and she was turning blue and I thought, her voice broke. I thought I was going to lose her. But you didn't, Richard said firmly, holding her tighter. She's okay. Look at her, she's breathing, she's stable, she's going to be fine. The doctor says she needs a nebulizer at home. Industrial grade, not the cheap one insurance covers. It's $3,000. Claire pulled back, wiping her eyes. $3,000 for a machine that keeps my daughter alive and I don't have it. I can't even keep the lights on, and now I need $3,000 and I don't know what to. I'll buy it, Richard said. No. Claire. Richard took her shoulders gently. This isn't charity. This isn't a test. This is me, a man with more money than God, buying a machine that will help a little girl breathe. Please don't make this complicated. Claire stared at him and Richard saw the war in her eyes. Pride versus love, independence versus necessity, the fierce desire not to be saved against the undeniable fact that she needed saving. Why are you doing this? She whispered. Because last night you told me I was worth loving without conditions, Richard said quietly. And no one's ever said that to me before. So now I'm going to prove you right by loving someone else the same way. No tests. No conditions. Just love. Claire's eyes filled with fresh tears. I don't know how to accept this. Then don't accept it. Just let it happen. Richard glanced at Emma, sleeping peacefully now despite the tubes and monitors. She looks like you. She looks like trouble, Claire said, managing a weak smile. She's stubborn and fearless and absolutely certain she's going to be an astronaut someday, even though I keep trying to explain that astronauts need to be good at math and she thinks multiplication is optional. Richard laughed, actually laughed, the sound surprising him. A doctor entered, clipboard in hand, looking exhausted. Ms. Mitchell? Emma's responding well to treatment. We'll keep her through tomorrow for observation, but barring complications, she should be able to go home the day after. Thank you, Claire breathed. The doctor left, and Claire sank back into the chair beside Emma's bed. Richard pulled up another chair and sat beside her. You should go home, Claire said. Get some sleep. You don't need to stay here. Neither do you, but you're not leaving. She's my daughter. And you're? Richard stopped, surprised by what he'd been about to say. You're someone I care about. Claire looked at him sharply. You've known me for one day. Time doesn't matter as much as truth, Richard said. And the truth is, you've changed my life more in 24 hours than most people have in 73 years. They sat in silence for a while, watching Emma breathe, listening to the steady rhythm of monitors confirming life, confirming survival, confirming that sometimes, just sometimes, things worked out. I rewrote my will this morning, Richard said quietly. Because of you. What? My old will was full of tests and conditions. I was trying to control my children from beyond the grave, trying to make them prove they deserved what I'd built. But you made me realize that love isn't something you earn, something you give. So I'm giving them everything. No strings attached. Claire studied his face in the dim hospital light. They're very lucky. They don't know it yet. They probably won't believe it when they find out. But maybe that's the point, giving people what they need instead of what they expect. Is that what you're doing with me? Claire asked. Giving me what I need. No, Richard said honestly. I'm giving me what I need. Which is the chance to be better than I've been. The chance to love someone without agenda. The chance to. He paused, struggling with words. The chance to be a father again. A real one this time. Claire's breath caught. Richard. I know this is fast. I know it's insane. But sitting here watching you with your daughter, I realized something. Richard turned to face her fully. I have billions of dollars and no one to leave them to who I actually love. You have a daughter who needs things I can provide. And maybe, just maybe, we can help each other. Help each other how? Richard took a deep breath, knowing what he was about to say would sound crazy, knowing it violated every logical principle he'd built his life around, but saying it anyway because Claire had taught him that sometimes the illogical thing was the true thing. Let me be Emma's grandfather, Richard said. Not legally, not officially, but really. Let me be the person who makes sure she has her nebulizer and her medicine and her chance at being an astronaut. Let me be the person who shows up at school plays and birthday parties and all the small moments that make a childhood. Let me love her the way I failed to love my own children. Claire stared at him, tears streaming down her face. And in return, Richard continued, you teach me how to be human again. You show me what matters. You remind me every day that good people aren't the ones who pass tests. They're the ones who make you want to be better. This is crazy, Claire whispered. Completely, Richard agreed. You're a billionaire. I'm a waitress. This doesn't make sense. Since when does family make sense? The word hung between them. Family, absurd and impossible and somehow exactly right. Emma stirred in her sleep, and Claire reached out instinctively to brush hair from her daughter's forehead. Richard watched the gesture, so simple, so full of love, and felt something in his chest crack open. I don't know how to do this, Claire said quietly. I don't know how to let someone help. I've been doing everything alone for so long. Then learn, Richard said gently. The same way I'm learning how to love people without testing them first. We'll figure it out together. Claire looked at him for a long moment, and Richard saw her making the same impossible calculation he'd made, weighing logic against need, pride against love, fear against the slim possibility that maybe, just maybe, this strange old billionaire meant every word he was saying. Okay, she whispered finally. But we do this my way. No throwing money at problems. No trying to control things. No tests. You want to be Emma's grandfather? Then you show up. You be present. You love her without expecting anything back. Can you do that? I don't know, Richard admitted. But I want to try. That's all I'm asking. They shook hands, a formal gesture that felt absurdly ceremonial and perfectly appropriate. A contract sealed not in boardrooms but in a hospital room, not with lawyers but with tears and honesty and the desperate hope that broken people could help each other heal. Emma's eyes fluttered open and she looked around groggily, confused by the hospital room and the oxygen mask. Mama, she whispered. I'm here, baby. Claire leaned over, kissing her daughter's forehead. You're okay. You're safe. Emma's eyes found Richard and she frowned slightly. Who's that? Claire glanced at Richard, a question in her eyes. He nodded. That's. Claire paused then smiled. That's your grandpa, Richard. He came to make sure you're okay. I don't have a grandpa, Emma said, confused. You do now, Richard said softly, moving closer. And I hear you want to be an astronaut. Emma's face lit up despite the oxygen mask, despite the monitors, despite everything. I'm going to the moon. Then I guess I better make sure you get there, Richard said. And sitting in that hospital room watching a little girl's eyes shine with dreams she might actually achieve now, Richard Ashford finally understood what his billions were actually worth. Not power. Not control. Not proof that he'd been right about humanity's corruption. Just this, the chance to be part of something bigger than himself. The chance to love without conditions. The chance to be better. 3 months later, Richard stood in Claire's new apartment. Not new but new to her, a 2-bedroom in a safe neighborhood with good schools and heat that actually worked. He'd helped her move in yesterday carrying boxes alongside Emma, who'd insisted on helping by carrying her stuffed animals one at a time up 3 flights of stairs. Now the apartment was chaos. Boxes everywhere, furniture half-assembled, Emma's space drawings already taped to the refrigerator. But it was warm and bright, and when Claire walked through it she moved differently. Lighter. Like someone who'd finally stopped bracing for the next disaster. The bookshelf is crooked, Richard observed, studying his handiwork. It's perfect, Claire said firmly. She was wearing jeans and an old t-shirt, hair in a messy bun, looking nothing like the exhausted waitress from Millie's diner. She looked happy. You did good, Grandpa. The nickname still made Richard's chest tight. Emma had started using it at the hospital and it had stuck. Now he was Grandpa Richard, not Mr. Ashford, not Sir, just Grandpa. The man who showed up every week with groceries and terrible jokes and an infinite willingness to hear about the solar system. Emma? Claire called. Come show Grandpa what you made. Emma bounded out of her new bedroom, holding a drawing. She thrust it at Richard proudly. It's the moon landing, she announced. See? That's Neil Armstrong and that's Buzz Aldrin and that's me. I'm the first girl to walk on Mars. Mars, not the moon? Richard asked. The moon's already done, Emma said with 7-year-old logic. I gotta do something new. Fair enough. Richard studied the drawing seriously. This is excellent work. Very scientifically accurate. Emma beamed. Mama says you're rich. Are you rich enough to send me to space? Emma? Claire's voice held a warning. What? You said Grandpa has lots of money. I said Grandpa is very successful. That's different. Seems the same. Richard laughed. He'd been doing that more lately, laughing. Actual, genuine laughter that came from somewhere deeper than politeness or performance. Tell you what, Richard said, crouching to Emma's level. You focus on school, especially that math you think is optional, and I'll focus on making sure you have every opportunity to study space when you're older. Deal? Deal? Emma threw her arms around his neck and Richard hugged her back, marveling at how natural it had become. This affection, this easy love that asked for nothing in return. Emma ran back to her room, and Claire handed Richard a beer from the refrigerator that now actually worked. You're good with her, Claire said. She makes it easy. They moved to the small balcony, barely big enough for 2 chairs, and sat watching the neighborhood. Kids playing basketball in the street. Neighbors calling to each other. Normal life, the kind Richard had spent 73 years avoiding. I talked to Jennifer yesterday, Richard said quietly. Claire looked over sharply. She knew about his children, knew about the complicated, painful history, knew about the new will that had shocked everyone. How did it go? Better than expected. Worse than hoped. Richard sipped his beer. She's still angry about the will. Says I'm manipulating them even now, using lack of conditions as another kind of test. But at least she's talking to me. That's progress. Michael won't return my calls. Give him time. I'm 73. I don't have infinite time. Claire reached over and squeezed his hand. Then use the time you have. Keep showing up. Keep trying. That's all you can do. It was the same advice she'd given him a dozen times, and it was starting to sink in. You couldn't force people to forgive you. You couldn't make them love you. You could only be present, be honest, and hope that eventually they saw you were trying. Comment below, have you ever had to rebuild a relationship? Share your story. I'm going back to school, Claire said suddenly. Richard looked at her in surprise. Really? Night classes. Nursing program at the community college. I start in January. She smiled, nervous and excited. It'll take 3 years while I work, but Emma will be 10 by then, and I'll be able to get a real job, make real money, actually have a career instead of just surviving. That's wonderful, Richard said, meaning it. I'm proud of you. Claire's eyes glistened. You made this possible. The apartment, Emma's medical bills, having enough margin to breathe. I couldn't have done this without you. You would have found a way. You're the strongest person I know. Maybe. But I'm glad I didn't have to do it alone this time. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over their imperfect, beautiful neighborhood. Richard thought about the man he'd been 3 months ago, cynical, isolated, using money to test people's worthiness. He thought about the will he'd written, full of conditions and judgments. He thought about all the years he'd wasted believing that love was transactional. Then he thought about Emma's drawing on his refrigerator. He'd taken one home, insisted on it. He thought about Claire's weekly dinners that he attended religiously. He thought about being called Grandpa and meaning it. "I have something to tell you," Richard said. "About the will." Claire tensed slightly. "Okay. I've made you and Emma beneficiaries. Not for everything. Michael and Jennifer still get the bulk of it, but enough that Emma's education is covered. College, graduate school, whatever she needs. And enough that you'll never have to choose between medicine and electricity again." Claire was quiet for a long moment. "Richard, before you argue, let me finish." Richard set down his beer and turned to face her fully. "This isn't charity. This is family. You taught me what that word actually means, and I'm not going to apologize for taking care of my family. We've known each other for 3 months. I've known my children for 45 years and I barely know them at all. Time doesn't make family. Love does." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "You're an impossible man, you know that? I'm learning to be better. You already are better." They hugged, and Richard felt the same thing he'd felt in the hospital, the sense of being part of something real, something that mattered more than all the billions in his bank account. Inside, Emma called out, "Mama, Grandpa, come see my room. I organized everything." They went inside to find Emma's room in a state that could charitably be called chaos with intention. Stuffed animals covered the bed. Books were stacked in precarious towers. Her drawings covered every available wall surface, including some that really shouldn't have been drawn on. "It's perfect," Richard said solemnly. "It really is," Emma said, satisfied. That night, Richard drove back to his Manhattan penthouse. He'd kept it, though he spent less time there now. The doorman greeted him with the usual deference. The elevator whisked him to the 47th floor, and he entered his pristine, professionally decorated apartment that looked like a museum of his own wealth. It felt empty. Not empty like it had before when he'd felt the absence of people without understanding why. Empty like something he'd outgrown, like clothes that no longer fit. Richard walked to his desk and pulled out his phone. He looked at the photos he'd taken today, Emma holding her space drawing, Claire laughing on the balcony, the three of them making silly faces at the camera. Then he opened his contacts and scrolled to Jennifer's number. He'd called her yesterday. She'd been cold, angry, unwilling to forgive. But Claire had said to keep showing up, to keep trying. So Richard called again. "Jennifer? It's Dad. I know you're angry. I know you think I'm manipulating you. But I wanted to tell you about Emma. She's 7 and she wants to be an astronaut, and she reminds me so much of you at that age, the way you wanted to be a veterinarian, remember? Before I told you it wasn't practical, before I pushed you toward business school. I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry about a lot of things. I'd like to tell you about them if you'll let me. Not now, not if you're not ready. But someday. I'll keep calling until you answer. Not because I need you to forgive me, but because I love you. No conditions. No tests. Just love. Call me back when you're ready." He hung up before he could lose his nerve. The phone didn't ring immediately. That was okay. Healing took time. Richard walked to his window and looked out over Manhattan. The city he'd conquered, the empire he'd built, the kingdom that had never felt like home. Then he looked at Emma's drawing on his refrigerator. She'd insisted he take one for his fancy apartment. "That's me going to Mars," she'd written in wobbly letters. "Love, Emma. P.S. You're the best grandpa ever." Richard Ashford had spent 73 years building an empire worth $4 billion. But standing in his empty penthouse, looking at a child's drawing held up by magnets, he realized he'd finally found something worth more than money. A family that wasn't based on blood or obligation or conditions. A family based on choice. A family based on love. 2 weeks later, Richard sat in a conference room with his attorney, Michael, and Jennifer. He'd finally convinced them both to meet, not to discuss the will but to discuss the future. "I'm dying," Richard said without preamble. Jennifer gasped. Michael went pale. "Not immediately," Richard clarified. "But I'm 73, I've had a heart attack, and according to my doctors, I have maybe 5 good years left if I'm lucky. So I wanted to talk to you both while I still can." "About the will," Michael said flatly. "No. About us." The siblings exchanged confused glances. "I've been a terrible father," Richard continued. "I treated you like investments instead of children. I made you perform for my love instead of giving it freely. I tested you constantly and made you feel like you were never enough. And I'm sorry. I'm more sorry than I know how to say. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. Michael's jaw clenched. I don't expect you to forgive me, Richard said. I don't deserve forgiveness. But I want you to know that I'm trying to be better. I've met someone, a woman and her daughter, who reminded me what family is supposed to be. And I'd like to introduce you to them, not because they're replacing you, but because I think they could teach us all how to be family to each other. The waitress, Jennifer said quietly. Mom told me. She said you're having some kind of crisis and you're making decisions based on a stranger's sob story. She's not a stranger, Richard said. And it's not a sob story. It's a relationship. One where I love someone without expecting anything in return. I'd forgotten what that felt like. And us? Michael asked, his voice hard. Do you love us without expecting anything in return? I do now, Richard said honestly. I didn't before. Before, I loved you contingent on you being who I wanted you to be. But I'm learning. And I hope, his voice cracked. I hope you'll give me the chance to prove it. Silence filled the conference room. Then Jennifer stood and walked around the table. She stopped in front of Richard, and for a moment he thought she might slap him. Instead, she hugged him. I'm still angry, she whispered against his shoulder. I'm so angry at you for wasting all these years. I know. But I'm willing to try. If you really mean it, if you're really trying to change, I'm willing to try. Richard hugged his daughter back, tears streaming down his face, feeling 50 years of walls crumbling. Michael stood more slowly, more hesitantly. He didn't hug Richard, but he extended his hand. I need time, Michael said. I can't just forgive you because you've decided to have a change of heart. But, he paused. But I'd like to meet this woman. And her daughter. If they've somehow managed to get through to you when we couldn't, I want to understand how. Richard shook his son's hand, knowing it wasn't reconciliation yet, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, he'd learned, were worth more than perfect endings. 6 months after walking into Millie's diner to test a waitress with a $10 tip, Richard Ashford sat in Claire's living room surrounded by chaos. Emma was explaining the solar system to Michael and Jennifer using a model she'd built from styrofoam balls and coat hangers. Claire was in the kitchen making dinner, she'd insisted, despite Richard offering to cater. Jennifer was asking questions about nursing school. Michael was laughing at one of Emma's jokes. It wasn't perfect. Michael was still distant, still processing. Jennifer still had moments of anger that flashed like lightning. Claire sometimes pulled back when Richard tried to help, her pride warring with her gratitude. Emma occasionally asked uncomfortable questions about why Grandpa Richard's real grandkids didn't visit more often. But it was real. Real in a way Richard's life had never been real before. Grandpa, Emma said, interrupting Michael mid-question, when I go to Mars, will you watch from Earth? I'll watch from wherever I am, Richard promised. Even if you're in heaven? The room went quiet. Adults didn't know how to answer questions like that, questions about mortality from children who thought death was just another destination. Especially from heaven, Richard said finally. I'll have the best view. Emma seemed satisfied with this answer and returned to explaining why Mars was better than Venus. Spoiler, Mars had cooler robots. Claire caught Richard's eye from the kitchen and smiled, not the tired, desperate smile of a woman barely surviving, but the genuine smile of someone who'd found unexpected joy. Richard smiled back, then looked around the room at his impossible, imperfect, beautiful family. He thought about the will he'd rewritten, simple now, full of love instead of conditions, dividing his billions equally among his children and ensuring Emma's future was secure. He thought about the company he'd started, transitioning leadership of, letting go of control for the first time in 50 years. He thought about all the tests he'd administered over his lifetime, trying to catch people being corrupt, being selfish, being human. And he thought about Claire's words that had started all of this. Good people aren't the ones who pass your tests. Good people are the ones who make you want to be better. Richard Ashford had spent 73 years looking for good people. But in the end, he'd learned something more important. How to be one himself. 4 years later, Emma stood at her middle school science fair, explaining her project on Mars colonization to a panel of judges. She was 11 now, confident and bright, wearing a shirt that said "Future Astronaut," that Richard had given her. Richard watched from the audience, sitting between Claire, who'd graduated nursing school and was now working at County General, and Jennifer, who'd brought her 2 kids to see their cousin Emma present. Michael couldn't make it. He was in California, running a startup, finally pursuing his own dreams instead of trying to please his father. But he'd called that morning to wish Emma luck. She's going to win, Jennifer whispered. Obviously, Richard said. She's brilliant. She gets that from Claire. She gets it from both her mothers, Richard said, and Jennifer squeezed his hand. Emma finished her presentation to enthusiastic applause. She bounced over to them, electric with excitement. Did you see? I didn't even mess up the part about atmospheric pressure. You were perfect, Claire said, hugging her daughter. Grandpa, did you know the judges asked me about funding for Mars missions? I told them my grandpa was super rich and would probably pay for it. Richard laughed. Did you really? Well, it's true, isn't it? That's not how space programs work, sweetie, Claire said, amused. Yet, Emma said confidently, and Richard believed her. If anyone could talk NASA into letting a billionaire's granddaughter go to Mars, it was Emma. That night, Richard sat in his study, not the Manhattan penthouse which he'd sold last year, but a modest house in Claire's neighborhood. He was writing in the journal his therapist had recommended, documenting his journey from cynic to whatever he was now. Good person felt presumptuous. Better person felt accurate. He wrote about Emma's science fair, about Jennifer's visit, about the call from Michael. He wrote about Claire falling asleep on his couch while studying for her nursing certification exam. He wrote about the small, ordinary moments that had become his whole life. Then he pulled out a letter he'd been working on, not to his children this time but to himself. The younger version of himself who'd walked into Millie's diner believing people were fundamentally corrupt. Dear Richard, you're going to meet a waitress who tries to refuse your money. When that happens, don't analyze it. Don't turn it into a test. Just let yourself be amazed that someone exists who would choose dignity over desperation. You're going to rewrite your will. Do it without hesitation. Your children don't need more conditions, they need more love. You're going to be scared. You're going to think you're too old to change, too set in your ways, too damaged by your own philosophy. Change anyway. You're going to fall in love, not with a woman, though Claire is wonderful, but with life itself. With showing up. With being present. With loving people without expecting anything in return. It won't be easy. Jennifer will take 2 years to fully trust you. Michael will take longer. You'll make mistakes. You'll backslide into old patterns. You'll catch yourself testing people, judging them, trying to prove your old theories right. But Emma will call you Grandpa, and that will matter more than being right. Trust the process. Trust that vulnerability isn't weakness. Trust that you can be worth loving without conditions. Trust that it's never too late to become the person you should have been all along. Love your future self. Richard folded the letter and placed it in his desk drawer next to Emma's Mars drawings and Claire's nursing school acceptance letter. Then he did something he'd never done before in his 77 years. He said a prayer of gratitude. Not to any specific deity, Richard had never been religious, but to the universe, to chance, to whatever cosmic force had sent him into that diner on that specific day to meet a waitress who would save his life by trying to refuse his tip. Comment below, what's the best life lesson you've ever learned? We'd love to hear from you. Downstairs he heard Emma and Claire laughing about something. He heard Jennifer helping put away dishes. He heard the ordinary sounds of family, real family, chosen family, imperfect and beautiful and more valuable than all the billions in his bank account. Richard Ashford closed his journal and went downstairs to join them. Because that's what good people do. They show up. They love without conditions. They make each other want to be better. And sometimes, if they're very lucky, they get the chance to learn that lesson before it's too late. Thank you for listening to this emotional journey. Richard learned that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the relationships we build and the lives we touch. What will you do differently today to show someone they matter?